All right, here in our project, in the source folder, I'm going to add a new folder called HOC, short for higher order components. We're going to write all the code for this demo inside this folder. So let's add a new component called movie.jsx. Now here I've installed a very powerful plugin called React.js Code Snippets. Let me show you. So let's go to install extensions. Here's the component I was talking about, React.js Code Snippets. If you haven't installed this, definitely do it because it makes it a lot faster to develop React applications. So with this component installed, I can type RCC, as in short for React Class Component, and press Tab. There you go. We have a basic boilerplate for a React Class Component. Now in this movie component, we simply want to render movie. Now let's say we want to enhance this component and give it the tooltip functionality. We're going to implement that functionality somewhere else in a higher order component, not here. So in the same folder, I'm going to add a new file. Now look at the naming convention, with tooltip. So by convention, we prefix these components with the word with. So with tooltip.jsx. Now here we're going to create a function called with tooltip. This function should take an existing component as an argument. So component. Now, in this function, we should return a new component that wraps our original component. It's going to enhance it. So let's return. Now here's a question. How do we create a class component? We type class, let's say with tooltip, extends react.component, right? That is how we create a class component. So in our function, we are returning a new component. That component is called with tooltip. Now let's import React on the top. All right. Now, in this class component, we need a render method, right? Inside the render method, we should return some elements. Let's say we're going to have a div, and inside this div, we want to render the component that is passed here. So we add that like this. However, as you know, this code is not going to work because if you want to use this argument as a component to render, we should capitalize the first letter. So capital C and capital C. Now, let's export this function. Export default with tooltip. Save the changes. I've installed Prettier. That is why my code gets reformatted every time I save the changes. All right, now let's go to our app.js. To keep things clean, I'm going to remove all the markup here. Instead, we want to render a movie component. So movie, there you go. I've also installed the auto import plugin. I believe I explained it earlier in the course. So whenever I reference a component, this plugin automatically adds the import statement. Now, let's save the changes and go back to the browser. So here's our movie component. Currently, it doesn't have any tooltip functionality, but we're going to enhance it with our higher order component. The first step is to go to movie.jsx. And instead of exporting this movie class, we want to wrap this with our higher order component function. So here we should call with tooltip and pass the movie class as an argument, okay? Now let's save the changes back in the browser. We still see the same result. However, if you look at the component structure in this document, you're going to see something different. So let's open Chrome Developer Tools. If you have installed React Dev Tools, you should see these two tabs here, Components and Profiler. In the Components tab, you can see the component hierarchy of this document. So on the top, we have the app component. Below that, we have with tooltip. That is our higher order component. And below that, we have our movie component. Now we're going to implement all the tooltip functionality inside this component. So here's our higher order component. In this component, we should have some state that would determine whether we should show a tooltip or not. So let's set state to a new object with a property called show tooltip, which we initially set to false. Now, over here in this div, we need to handle the mouse events such as mouse over and mouse out. So on mouse over and on mouse out. Now let's quickly create a couple of event handlers. So mouse over. Here we use a Lambda expression. In the body of this Lambda expression, we're going to call this .setState and set show tooltip to true. Now let's duplicate this line and rename this to mouse out. And here we want to set the show tooltip property to false. Next, we're going to hook this up. So here we call this .mouse over. And here we call this .mouse out. We're almost done. Now, finally, we need to pass this state as a prop to this wrapped component. So let's give it a new prop called show tooltip. And here we pass this .state .show tooltip. Okay, save the changes. Now let's go to our movie component. All we have to do here is to render the tooltip conditionally based on the value of our show tooltip prop. So let me wrap this in parentheses and break it up into multiple lines so we can see clearly. So here's where we render a movie. Now right below that, we can use an expression like this. This .props .show tooltip and here's a markup for our tooltip. Some tooltip. Now in the real application, we're going to decorate this with a bunch of classes to make it look fancy. But in this section, we don't want to worry about any of these distractions. We just want to focus on the advanced React concepts. So save the changes. Now back in the browser, let's test our implementation. So hover, there you go. Here's our tooltip. Now let's bring up Chrome Developer Tools one more time and go to the Components tab. So here's our higher order component. It has this state, show tooltip, and it's passing this as a prop to our movie component. You can see that over here. Now there is a tiny problem in our implementation. Let me show you. Here in the app component, let's give our movie component a new prop, like ID equals 1. Save the changes. Back in the browser, look at the movie component. We don't see the ID prop here. The reason this is happening is because we forgot to pass the props in our higher order component. So here in the with tooltip component, where we render our wrapped component, we should pass any existing props. Currently, we are only passing this new prop. So that's the reason why the ID prop is not passed. But that is a very simple fix. We use the spread operator to pass any props that we have passed from the outside. So save the changes. Now back in the browser. And here's the ID prop passed to our movie component. So to implement a higher order component, we create a new function that takes an existing component, and here we return a new component. In this implementation, I'm returning a class component, but we can also return a functional component. All we are doing here is implementing some logic, and we're sharing this logic across different components.